The wind had a cruel, personal edge to it, scouring the dust from the single street of redemption and flinging it into Alara's face. It was a grit that worked its way into her eyes, her mouth, the very seams of her worn woolen dress. Each stinging particle felt like a whispered judgment, an echo of the words that had just sealed her fate. She stood frozen before the mercantile, a small, discarded piece of luggage on the plank sidewalk beside her. Inside, the shadow of Mr. Abernathy, the man she had crossed a continent to marry, moved behind the pristine glass of his shop window, his form a dark blot of finality. He had not shouted. His cruelty was of a quieter, more devastating sort. He had inspected her as one would livestock, his gaze lingering on her plain, calloused hands, her simple, unadorned face, the homespun fabric of her traveling clothes. Then, with a sigh of profound disappointment, he had delivered the verdict to the town's taciturn sheriff. "She is not as advertised," he'd stated, his voice carrying the smooth, oiled certainty of a man accustomed to getting precisely what he paid for. "Too simple. I am returning the goods returned." The word was a brand, sizzling into her soul. She was not a woman, not a person, but goods. Faulty merchandise. Her entire world, which for 3 months on a rattling train had been a fragile vessel of hope, had just been dashed to splinters against the hard-packed earth of this godforsaken town. Despair was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. Where was she to go? The fare that brought her here had taken every last cent she possessed. To go back was impossible. To stay was untenable. The faces that passed her were a gallery of morbid curiosity. Women peered from behind twitching curtains. Men paused their whittling on the saloon porch, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. She was a spectacle, a cautionary tale. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, trying to summon the memory of green hills and damp earth, of a home that was no longer hers. All she could conjure was the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels, a sound that had once sung of new beginnings and now mocked her with its memory of forward motion. She was motionless, trapped. A horse snorted nearby, a sound that cut through the oppressive silence of her thoughts. She opened her eyes. Across the street, leaning against a support post of the livery stable, was a man. He was unlike the others, where the townsmen were stout and soft from their commerce. He was lean and weathered, carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. Dust clung to his worn leather chaps and the brim of his hat, which was pulled low, shadowing his face. He wasn't staring with the same avid hunger as the others. His gaze was level, quiet, and unervingly direct. He was just watching, not her precisely, but the entire pathetic tableau, as if it were a play he had seen performed too many times before. For a brief, terrifying moment, their eyes met. There was no pity in his, and for that she was strangely grateful. There was only a stillness, a deep and abiding quiet that seemed to suck all the noise of her shame into a void. Then he turned his head, spat a thin stream of tobacco juice into the dust, and went back to studying the far horizon, as if she were no longer of any consequence. The dismissal should have hurt, another cut to add to the dozens she'd sustained that morning. Instead, it felt like a reprieve. To be ignored was a blessing. To be unseen was a shield. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the vast, empty sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The wind did not relent. Alara pulled her thin shawl tighter, the simple fabric a poor defense against the cold that came not from the air, but from the marrow of her bones. She was alone, utterly and completely. The man across the street pushed himself off the post and moved with an unhurried grace toward a tethered horse. He didn't look her way again. He simply mounted, and with a quiet word to the animal, rode out of town, a solitary figure dissolving into the immense, indifferent twilight. His departure left a void, and the stares of the townspeople felt sharper than before. Days bled into one another, each a study in quiet perseverance. The sheriff, a man whose weary eyes held a sliver of decency, had arranged for her to take a room at the back of the boarding house in exchange for work. It was little more than a closet with a cot, but it was a roof. Her life became a cycle of lye soap, boiling water, and endless sheets, of scrubbing floors until her knuckles were raw and her back screamed in protest. She moved through the town like a ghost, keeping her eyes downcast, her words few. She learned the rhythms of redemption. The boisterous Saturday nights, the somber Sunday mornings, the quiet hum of commerce on weekdays. And she learned about him. Silas. That was his name. He ran a small ranch some miles out, a place the townspeople spoke of with a kind of grudging respect and suspicion. He kept to himself, they said. He was not a man for pleasantries or town socials. He came in for supplies, conducted his business with clipped efficiency, and left. He was an outsider, same as her. She saw him once a week. He would ride in on that same dark horse, its coat gleaming with health. He would tether it outside the mercantile, Abernathy's mercantile, and stride inside. Elara, often shaking out rugs at the boarding house across the way, would watch from the corner of her eye. He never acknowledged her presence, yet she felt his awareness of her all the same. It was in the way he never joined the men who sometimes made low comments as she passed, in the way his gaze would sweep the street and seem to pause for a fraction of a second on her, a neutral, unreadable assessment. One afternoon, while she was hanging laundry in the wind-whipped yard behind the boarding house, a gust tore a sheet from her grasp and sent it tumbling toward the street. Before she could chase it, a shadow fell over her. It was Silas, his horse waiting patiently behind him. He held the sheet out to her, folded neatly in his hands. It was startling to see it contained by his large, sun-browned fingers, the same hands she'd seen handle horse reins with such authority. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. He only nodded. His eyes, she saw now, were the color of the prairie in a drought, a pale, clear hazel that missed nothing. He lingered for a moment, his gaze falling to the basket of wet laundry, then to her red, chapped hands. He said nothing, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Then he turned and walked away. The next week, a small, unmarked sack appeared on the back stoop of the boarding house. Inside was a block of tallow salve, smelling faintly of pine. There was no note.
No explanation.
But she knew. She began to use it every night, the soothing balm a small, secret comfort. Their interactions remained sparse, fragments of moments in the dusty street. He left a brace of rabbits on the stoop one morning. She left a freshly baked loaf of bread on his saddle the next time he was in town. No words were ever exchanged about the gifts. It was a silent conversation, a language of necessity and acknowledgement spoken in the vast emptiness of their shared solitude. She began to look for his arrival, the sight of his steady form riding into town a quiet anchor in her week. She learned to read the set of his shoulders, the tension in his hands, the rare, almost imperceptible softening of his mouth when he looked at his horse. He was a man who communicated not with his tongue, but with his entire being. One day, Mr. Abernathy cornered her outside the post office. He had been avoiding her, but his patience, it seemed, had run out. "I hear you've made yourself at home," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "One would think a woman of your station would have the decency to move on." Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She tried to step around him, but he blocked her path. "This town is a respectable place. Your presence here is an embarrassment, a reminder of a failed transaction. Please, let me pass," she murmured, her eyes fixed on a crack in the boardwalk. "I want you gone," he hissed, his face unpleasantly close. "I don't care where you go, but you will not stay in my town." Just then, the familiar sound of Silas's horse came to a stop nearby. Abernathy glanced over, his lip curling in a sneer. "Ah, the savage. Birds of a feather. I suppose." He turned his attention back to Elara. "Take your charity from him and get out." Silas dismounted, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He didn't look at Abernathy. He looked at Elara. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had ever addressed her so directly in public. Abernathy laughed, a short, ugly sound. "No problem at all. Just instructing this simple creature on the finer points of propriety. Something you wouldn't understand." He gestured dismissively at Elara. Honestly, what could a man like you possibly want with her? She has nothing. She is nothing. Plain as mud, the word hung in the air. Simple. Alara flinched, the old wound tearing open. She felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck, the town's eyes all suddenly upon her. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole. Silas's gaze didn't waver from Alara's face. He saw the tremor in her chin, the way her shoulders curled inward as if to ward off a physical blow. He saw the color drain from her cheeks, leaving her looking as fragile as a winter leaf. The entire street had gone quiet, the townsfolk drawn to the confrontation like moths to a flame. They were vultures, waiting to feast on her humiliation. Abernathy, puffed up with his own self-importance, smirked, certain of his victory. He had laid her bare, defined her with his contempt, and now he was waiting for her to shatter. Silas took a slow step forward, placing himself partially between Alara and the merchant. His presence was a solid wall, a sudden and unbreachable defense. He was taller than Abernathy, broader in the shoulders, and he seemed to draw all the air from the space around them. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. "What do you want with her?" Abernathy repeated, his voice laced with scorn. "She's not like the fancy women you see in the catalogs, Silas. She's a simple thing." Hardly worth the trouble, Silas finally turned his head, his hazel eyes pinning Abernathy in a gaze as cold and hard as river stone. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried with absolute clarity across the unnaturally silent street. Every word was deliberate, weighty. "I've had fancy," he said, the words low and resonant. The statement hung in the air, thick with a history no one there understood but him. Then he looked back at Alara, and the hardness in his eyes softened into something else, something protective and profound. "I want real." It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of value. In 2 short sentences, he had dismantled Abernathy's entire arsenal of shame. He had taken the man's weapon, Alara's supposed simplicity, and reforged it into a thing of worth. Real. The word settled over Alara, not a brand, but a balm. It soothed the raw, burning wound of Simple. It was an affirmation, a recognition of her substance, of the quiet resilience she had cultivated in the shadows of this town's judgment. Abernathy's face contorted, a mask of disbelief and fury. He had been publicly countered, his authority challenged not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, sputtering like a damp firecracker. He had no response. Silas had not played his game. He had simply swept the board clean. Without another glance at the sputtering merchant, Silas's attention returned fully to Alara. The question was in his eyes, gentle and direct. He was not commanding her, not rescuing her in the way a knight might a damsel. He was offering a choice, a path away from the man who had tried to destroy her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward his horse and the wagon tethered behind it, loaded with supplies. It was an invitation, an exodus. Alara felt a strength surge through her, a current of resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She looked from Silas's steady face to Abernathy's blotchy, enraged one, and then out at the sea of onlookers. Their curiosity no longer felt like a weapon against her. It was irrelevant. She met Abernathy's gaze one last time, her own eyes clear and unwavering. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own answer. With a dignity that felt entirely her own, she turned away from him and walked the few steps to Silas's wagon. Her own small valise, still holding the meager possessions of her old life, was back in her room at the boarding house, but she found she didn't care. It held nothing she wanted to keep. She paused beside the wagon wheel, her hand resting on the weathered wood. The world seemed to hold its breath. From this vantage point, she could see the entire town laid out before her, the false front of the mercantile, the judgmental windows of the boarding house, the faces of the people who had watched her suffer. It was a cage built of whispers and scorn, and the gate was finally open. Silas moved to stand beside her, his quiet solidity a comfort. He didn't rush her. He didn't speak. He simply waited, giving her the space to make the decision her own. He had cleared the path. She had to be the one to walk it. She looked up at him, at the lines etched around his eyes by sun and wind, at the firm, quiet line of his mouth. She saw not a savior, but a partner in solitude. A man who understood the value of things that did not glitter. A man who knew the difference between a shiny surface and a solid core. In his eyes, she saw not a reflection of her shame, but a reflection of the vast, open land that stretched out behind him. A land of hardship, yes, but also of honesty. A land where a person was measured by their endurance, their resilience, their reality. She gave a single, decisive nod, a silent acceptance, a quiet beginning. A small, genuine smile touched Silas's lips for the first time, a rare and precious thing that transformed his weathered face. He reached up, his large hand gently cupping her elbow, and helped her onto the wagon seat. The simple, respectful touch was more profound than any flowery promise. He untied the reins, climbed up beside her, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horse in motion. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting a new track in the dust, leaving redemption behind. Alara did not look back. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the endless expanse of the horizon where the sky met the earth. The wind that had once felt so cruel now felt clean, washing away the last vestiges of her humiliation, carrying the scent of sagebrush and freedom. They rode in a comfortable silence, the creak of the wagon and the steady plod of the horse the only sounds. This was not a fairy tale ending written in breathless prose. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more true. It was a journey undertaken by two solitary souls who had found in each other a shared language of resilience. The landscape unfolding before them was harsh and demanding, but it was real. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Alara felt that she was real too. Not simple, not returned, not an object of scorn or pity. She was Alara, and she was at long last heading home.